Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 253. Joseph Hawdon and Charles Bonney. Part 1. These men were pioneers and overlanders who took cattle from Albury, New South Wales to Adelaide in 1838. This venture helped fill in the map and would be the impetus for a succession of other parties making the long journey and for pioneering alternative routes. In 1836, Joseph Hawdon, together with John Gardner and John Hepburn, arranged to buy 335 head of cattle in New South Wales, and they took the stock overland to Port Phillip Bay, the first to come from New South Wales. Hawdon returned briefly to Sydney but moved to Melbourne in 1837, and in August of that year he took up land near the present site of Dandenong. Towards the end of 1837, the newly established South Australian settlement was threatened by famine. Sensing a commercial opportunity, Hawdon returned to New South Wales, where on the 4th of January 1838 he invited Charles Bonney to join an expedition to take 300 cattle to South Australia. Bonney accepted at once, saying, "I eagerly embraced the opportunity of gratifying my love of exploring new country," and joined his party. Hawdon set out from his own station 17 miles southeast of the Port Phillip settlement, crossing a small range of hills wooded with stringy bark. The rest of the journey to Melbourne was through an open forest well covered with grass. The next day he breakfasted with Captain Lonsdale, the police magistrate, who lent him a dray. Then he set off in company with the postman. Hawdon picked up Bonney at Mercersvale, now known as Beveridge, and crossed over the Great Divide, probably where Pretty Sally is, and arrived at the Goulburn River on the 5th of January, battling sand and lightning storms. He says he never regrets making the trip midsummer, but he may well have. A bit of winter rain would have made the long sandy stretches later in the journey more manageable and would also have meant more feed for the cattle. Finally, on the 22nd of January, with 9 in the party, they set out on an overland route to South Australia from Mitchellstown on the Goulburn River, now the site of Mitchelton Winery. Initially, they tried to follow Major Mitchell's descriptions, but found the Goulburn River took a far more northerly route than Mitchell had stated. They eventually found the Murray River after 2 days. They also discovered other inaccuracies in Mitchell's directions and decided to follow the Murray River rather than place reliance on Mitchell's descriptions of the country. They followed the Goulburn and arrived at the Goulburn-Murray junction on the 29th of January 1838, where they carved their names on trees. Their journal noted, 7 miles further we came upon a very deep creek, assuming it's the Campaspe River. The journal continued, we proceeded 2 miles further up the creek where we had to cut away the bank with pickaxes before we could get the drays over, and even then were obliged to unload and carry up the goods by hand. This crossing was likely to have been south of Rotary Park in Echuca. Charles Sturt left Sydney in April 1838 with 400 head of cattle and followed the Murray on his trek to Adelaide. After passing the Ovens River, the Murray spread over flats covered by masses of reeds, some 20 foot high, and they had to burn tracks through the reeds in order to get through. They crossed the Murray near the Edward River Junction in June 1838. Soon afterwards, the party came to the Goulburn, about a mile above its junction with the Murray, and Sturt saw the 2 trees on which Bonney and Hawdon had carved their names. No sign of the carvings remain today. Sturt stayed on the south bank of the Murray, no doubt passing close to the site of Echuca, and probably crossed the Campaspe at the same spot as Bonney and Hawdon. Sturt arrived in Adelaide in August 1838. Following the Murray westwards, Hawdon and his group came to what is now Swan Hill. On the 22nd of February, Hawdon recorded, "On the opposite bank of the river in front of our tent were a tribe of blacks having their bodies painted in white streaks. I think this might have been part of the tribe that attacked Major Mitchell in 1836. The date accords with Hawdon being in the region of Mount Dispersion, between Robinvale and Redcliffs, where Mitchell ambushed and killed Aborigines as he said they were threatening him. They then went on to Wentworth and at the meeting of the Murray and Darling rivers. Following the course of the Murray River, on the 4th of March, he discovered a lake in the Western Riverina region that he names Victoria after Queen Victoria. The country is mostly rolling sand hills, and the only feed for the cattle is the reeds along the river.
Further along, he's separated from the river by high, he says 200 to 300 foot, limestone cliffs, and each night must find a pass down to get the cattle to water. Near present-day Mildura, they used a sandbar to cross the north side of the river and then almost immediately came onto a confluence with the Darling. Much of this country was known to have been reported on by Major Mitchell after his expeditions in 1835 and 1836, which they forded without difficulty on the 1st of March. By the 10th of March, they were in South Australia and discovered Lake Bonney in northeastern South Australia. Hawdon named it after his companion in virtue of my privilege as its first European discoverer. Charles Bonney had a gentle nature and was a peacemaker, as shown by his dealings with Indigenous people during his travels with Hawdon. He wrote, "It was somewhere about the junction of the Murrumbidgee that we first established friendly relations with the natives. Up to this time they'd avoided us, but from this point the tribes used to assemble to see us pass and send forward messages to tell the next tribe of our approach. Once only we were in danger of coming into collision with them. It was my work to load the drays while Mr. Hawdon looked after the stockmen, and sometimes we'd ride ahead to see what country there was before us. On this occasion I directed the bullock drivers to go round the edge of a lagoon whilst I rode on to examine the country ahead. It seems that a tribe of natives were near the drays when I left them, and they went along the bank of the river to see the drays pass at the other end of the lagoon. The men mistook this for a hostile manoeuvre, and on my return I found the two parties drawn up in a battle array, the men with their guns ready to fire and the natives with their spears poised for action. The men hastily explained the situation in answer to my inquiry as to what was the matter, but from my knowledge of the customs of the natives, I knew the men were mistaken as to the intended attack, and I told them to put their guns down, rode up to the natives and made a well-known sign to them to lower their spears. They immediately obeyed the sign and we passed on in peace. Many collisions with the natives have no doubt occurred through similar misunderstandings." Bonney's calm reaction to a situation that could have resulted in violence was a far different outcome than Major Mitchell's when he met with the Indigenous people at a similar place along the Murray 18 months earlier. In May 1836, Mitchell and his surveying party had been followed for several days by a group of Aboriginal people on the banks of the Murray River. Rather than attempt negotiation, Mitchell and his men launched a surprise attack on the 27th of May, which became known as the Mount Dispersion Massacre, where at least 7 Indigenous people were murdered. Mitchell later published a book in which he justified the ambush as an act of self-defence. An inquiry was held to look into the affair, and Major Mitchell received a minor reprimand for the killings. Charles Bonney travelled with a small flute, which he'd play around the fire each evening. Hawdon wrote that one day there appeared hostile Aboriginals on the other side of the river. Bonney played his flute and soon all were friends. Another time, when Hawdon was threatened by an Indigenous man who pushed him with his tall digging stick, Hawdon reached for his gun. Thankfully, Bonney was present and told jokes to put everyone in good humour. The Indigenous inhabitants of the Murray were curious about the visitors, and their great mob of cattle, drays and oxen, a cavalcade of the likes they'd not seen before. Bonney wrote, "The natives often assembled in considerable numbers but were perfectly peaceable and caused no annoyance." Near Lake Bonney, they fell in with 2 natives who gave them to understand by signs that they belonged to a tribe some distance down the river and wanted to travel with them. This they were allowed to do, and they made themselves very useful as guides. Finding a solid surface along the riverbanks was hazardous, as some areas were covered in thick sand, which would bog a dray, causing a delay in the journey. However, once the natives joined them, such difficulties were overcome. Bonney wrote, "I was amazed at the intelligence they displayed. Before they'd been half a day with us, they knew as well as we did where a dray could go and where it could not go. Although they had never seen white men before, they never once made a mistake as to when we could keep the flats and when we must take high land." Hawdon speaks to the Aboriginal people all along the way, but he fears them too, often waving his gun at or shooting near them, though funnily enough the person who came nearest to being shot was Hawdon himself, when one of his men, in fear of his life, took a shot at a charging bullock and missed, and the ball grazed Hawdon's chest. When the river turned south at Overland Corner, they started to look out for the ranges which separate them from Adelaide. At Mount Barker, Hawdon could see across to Lake Alexandrina, through which the Murray drains to the sea, and then they must conduct the cattle down the precipitate slopes of Mount Lofty to the present-day Noarlunga and on to Adelaide, which had been settled a couple of years earlier and was 20 miles back up the coast. They travelled nearly 1,400 miles in 10 weeks and only lost 4 bullocks who'd been killed by lightning in a violent thunderstorm. They arrived in Adelaide with their stock in pretty good condition. They arrived on the 3rd of April 1838 and were greeted with some jubilation by the settlers, as there'd been a shortage of meat for some time. The newly established settlement had been living on kangaroo meat and anything else they could find, and the herd of cattle they brought was a welcome sight. The men were later honoured at a dinner presided over by the resident commissioner, James Hurtle Fisher, and an ox was roasted for the occasion. And in a South Australian newspaper, there was an advertisement, "Public Dinner to Mr. Hawdon." A number of persons have expressed a desire to testify their sense of the spirited and enterprising conduct of Mr. Hawdon in bringing cattle overland from New South Wales to Adelaide. It is proposed that a public dinner shall be given to that goodness, and a piece of plate shall be presented to him in commemoration of the event and as a testimony of the feeling of the colonists. Persons desirous of evincing their sentiments are invited to record their names in a paper left for this purpose as the post office. Note, an early day will be fixed for the dinner, of which notice will be given. And that was written in Adelaide on the 4th of May, 1838. Charles Sturt, in an official report made in August 1838, said of the journey, "Hawdon and Bonney could not have taken a more direct line or shortened the journey more wisely." So a little on the men themselves. Firstly, Joseph Hawdon. He was born on the 14th of November 1813 at Standrop in Durham, England. He was the son of John Hawdon and Elizabeth Hunt and was the youngest of 11 children. In 1834 he came to Australia at the suggestion of his older brother John, who'd arrived in Sydney with his wife and 2 sons in September 1828. John had rented a property, Eldersley, at the cow pastures. After he advised Joseph to join him, John settled at Begalia near Bateman's Bay. John had already had some mark as a cattle breeder, and the 2 brothers seemed to have worked in partnership for some time. In October 1836, Joseph Hawdon mustered a mob of cattle and brought them to Mr. Howe's on the Murrumbidgee. Here he was joined by John Gardner and Captain John Hepburn to be the first to overland cattle to Port Phillip. They set out on the Murrumbidgee, and Hepburn noted that both sides of the river were already taken up with squatting stations. At Gundagai, they met part of Major Thomas Mitchell's expedition, which had come from Portland Bay. Mr. Stapleton was in charge and gave them useful information on the route. They reached the Murray River in 14 days, following the tracks of Major Mitchell's carts, and crossed near Howlong. The Murray was running bank high, and they crossed by taking wheels off the dray and tying a tarpaulin around the body to get all safely across. The horses and cattle were far more troublesome, and Captain Hepburn's horse drowned. Black Dog Creek was so named because it was here that Joseph Hawdon shot a native dog. Captain Hepburn wrote, "At the Ovens River they broke an axle, and a number of natives made their appearance but disappeared when guns and pistols were produced. Joseph Hawdon rode after them and convinced one who'd seen white men before to return to the camp. This fellow caught turtles and made fire by friction and joined the overlanding party till they crossed the Goulburn, when he took his departure without ceremony." Gardner wrote that this native man was no use to them other than to lighten the load of their provisions. At the Goulburn they saw many signs to induce them to think that the numbers of Indigenous people in the area were many, but they never saw one. Then on the track made by Major Mitchell's party they came to an encampment of about 70 mia-meres, which were temporary bark huts. But Hepburn wrote that all the natives fled on their approach. At the camp they noticed small fragments of bottle glass. Hawdon's overlanding party then travelled towards Mount Macedon, and from an elevation, with the aid of a spyglass, saw a ship in the Bay of Port Phillip. The settlement of Melbourne was less than 2 years old and consisted of just a few huts. Hawdon, Gardner's and Hepburn's cattle were the first to come from New South Wales and were a welcome arrival. The enterprise was successful, and the 3 men remained in Victoria. In 1836, he said, "Soon after my arrival at Port Phillip, I formed a cattle station midway between the settlement and Western Port, current Dandenong. He was impressed with the potential of the new Melbourne settlement and was attracted by the rich black loam covered with ribgrass, one of the most nourishing grasses found in Australia." On the 1st of January 1837, Joseph Hawdon sailed with Captain John Hepburn from Port Phillip Bay for New South Wales, and Hawdon stayed for some time with his brother John and his family at Begalia near the Maria River. During the visit, Joseph must have given favourable reports about land opportunities on the Murray River, because later in 1837, John Hawdon set up a station at Howlong west of the crossing place. There is an account of the Hawdon brothers reaching the flooded Murray River in the winter of 1837 and crossing the swollen waterway by removing the wheels from a dray and strapping a tarpaulin under the body of the vehicle. This appears to be much the same method used the year before when Joseph crossed the river with Hepburn and Gardner. The result was a rough punt that they launched onto the stream in the hope of having it drift across by the aid of a tow rope. However, the rope broke and 3 men on the punt feared for their lives. One of their ticket of leave men dived into the flood and succeeded in guiding the punt across the river. This daring chap was John Conway Burke, and after congratulating him on the rescue, a few hours later the whole party was safe on the Victorian side. Joseph Hawdon was so impressed with Burke's willingness to face challenges, he made an offer telling the young man he intended to make a proposal to the governor to carry the mail between Melbourne and Yass. If successful, Burke could have the job. Hawdon writes, "Towards the end of 1837, I determined on making an arduous experiment of driving cattle for the first time since the colonisation of New Holland from eastern to southern Australia." His journey took him northeast from Port Phillip, then west along the Murray. Along the whole way, he encountered local Indigenous people and relations were generally friendly. Hawdon writes that he talked to the locals. The languages of these tribes west of Lake Bonney in South Australia is different than that of the tribes near the junction of the Murrumbidgee, north of Swan Hill, and the people are of a much milder and more friendly disposition. Lake Bonney was known to the locals as New Campka. Hawdon was successful in securing a contract of £1,200 a year to carry the overland mail fortnightly to Yass, at which point his postboy passed it to the mailman from Sydney, who transferred the southbound mail to him. This was a pioneer service. Before that, the mail had gone by sea. And true to his word, Hawdon's first postboy was John Conway Burke. In 1838, he rode 11,000 miles, 17,700 kilometres. Joseph Hawdon used the Howlong station as a staging place for his postmen to rest and change horses. After his 1838 trek with Bonney and party, in 1839 Hawdon desired another journey to South Australia and teamed up with Lieutenant Mundy and drove tandem over a more direct route between Melbourne and Adelaide. They left at noon on the 11th of July 1839. Lieutenant Alfred Mundy was late of the 21st Regiment. They travelled northwest to Expedition Pass near present-day Castlemaine and stopped at various squatter stations. They reached the Henty station near Casterton on the 25th of July, camped at Lake Mundy, a freshwater lake which Holloway named after Hawdon's companion, on the 27th of July, and then followed the tracks of the Holloway party, which they caught on the 2nd of August. They travelled close to the coast through the Coorong, crossed the Murray on the 8th of August, and arrived in Adelaide on the 11th of August. On his return, Hawdon made his headquarters in Melbourne, where he lived on his property, Banyule, at Heidelberg. This land area was between the Yarra River and the Deben Creek and was prime agricultural and grazing land. The government was parcelling it up for sale at the first government land auction that was held in Sydney in 1838. The fact that the sale was held in Sydney is significant. It meant you needed to be in Sydney to purchase. As a result, the land was purchased largely by Sydney-based speculators, especially Thomas Walker, who remained in Sydney. The 920-acre portion 6 that Banyule Homestead was later built on was purchased by Richard Henry Brown for £1,334. However, portion 5 to the west of the Banyule estate did not sell and was offered up for sale in Melbourne this time on the 26th of February 1840. The advertisement from the Port Phillip Herald on the 21st of February 1840 mentions Joseph Hawdon, who'd not yet built Banyule Homestead, being among the most respectable gentry who lived in the area on a romantic and beauteous road. Hawdon in fact made a number of purchases at Heidelberg, one comprised of 363 acres between Heartlands and the village, and the other was 700 acres covered with what we know as Banyule. On high ground he erected a small hut, and in front of it he set about building his Elizabethan Gothic revival-style mansion that he completed by 1846. Hawdon made use of the local sandstone for the foundations and used handmade bricks to build 30-inch walls. Use was made of cedar and teak timber, which came from England. Its ship-like joisting, dovetailing and wooden pegs suggested that a number of his building labourers were ex-sailors. Under the ownership of Hawdon, Banyule became the centre for social entertainment, and many visitors were thrilled to see the gleaming white building high on a point amongst the trees as they drove past the caretaker's cottage at the entrance to the estate. In a new small community as Port Phillip was in the early 1840s, there were many opportunities for civic-minded men to make a name for themselves by involving themselves in a whole range of societies and associations aimed at developing and improving the community. Joseph Hawdon was such a man. Some of the groups and activities he was involved in 1839 he was a member of the Melbourne Club. In June 1839 he was a member of the Provisional Board of the Melbourne and Port Phillip Bank. In July 1840 he was one of the members of the committee to make an address to Queen Victoria congratulating her on her marriage. Also in 1840 he was one of the directors of the Pastoral and Agricultural Society and a member of the committee and steward of the Port Phillip Turf Club. In October 1841 he attended the levee to welcome Governor George Gipps to the district of Port Phillip. In 1843 he was nominated as a member of the District Council of Bourke. In episode 33 I described an event in an episode based on Lady Janet Clark, and this was one of the first documented duels in Port Phillip and involved Mr. Peter Snodgrass, who was Lady Janet Clark's father, and Mr. William Ryrie on the 1st of January 1840. A part of the story I'll cover here, as the club was not provided with such gentlemanly indispensables as duelling pistols, and worse too, was impossible to procure any in town. Mr. Joseph Hawdon of Heidelberg was the possessor of a splendid case of hair triggers, which could be got only if their owner could be got at. But he was enjoying the pleasures of his peaceful home 8 miles in the country. Ryrie's second had a good horse in the club stable, and fresh from the land of green heath and shaggy wood was an expert plucky rider, as firm in the pigskin as on solid ground, and jumping up proclaimed his readiness to ride to Heidelberg, storm the Hawdon domicile, and either return with the pistols or never show his honest face amongst them. The offer was rapturously applauded. And so, arriving at his destination with the sleeping Hawdon awoken, the pistols obtained, and 8 miles back thundered over again in double quick time, never outpaced since. It was about 1 o'clock when the courier galloped up Collins Street, flourishing a pistol in each hand. And have a listen to episode 33 to hear the outcome of that duel. Joseph Hawdon married Emma Althwaite in Durham, England, on the 19th of January 1842. They had 4 children. Emma, who was born at Heidelberg on the 23rd of January 1843, then Arthur in 1844, Cyril in 1846 and Alice in 1848. In 1848 he took the Tallarook Run of 27,500 acres at the junction of the Goulburn River and Sunday Creek on Crown lease. In August 1851 he discovered a few grains of gold near the Yarra River. His wife Emma died in 1853, and on the 31st of January 1856 he married Mary McFarlane in Gainford, County Durham, England. Joseph was 22 years older than Mary. He was now 42 and Mary 21. They had a daughter, Rose, in 1870. She was born in Panama. Joseph remained in Victoria until 1858 when he returned to England. In 1863 he migrated to New Zealand and took up land between Christchurch and Westland. His son, Arthur Joseph, was reputed to have been the first child of European parentage to be born at Canterbury. He was nominated to the New Zealand Legislative Council in 1866, visited England again in 1867, and died at Christchurch on the 12th of April 1871. His youngest daughter was only 1. Hawdon was adventurous and alert to opportunity, and by his own success gave valuable service to developing new territory. Hawdon River and Lake Hawdon are named after him. And The Journal of a Journey from New South Wales to Adelaide, performed in 1838, written by Joseph Hawdon, is a slender hardback of 66 pages and was published in 1952, so 114 years after it was written. And it's kept at the South Australian State Archive, the Mitchell Library in New South Wales, and is also in possession of the family. Hawdon's children. Emma Josephine Hawdon was born on the 23rd of January 1843 in Heidelberg and married Robert Campbell on the 2nd of December 1868 in Christchurch, New Zealand. She died on the 17th of April 1890 at Otakaki, Dunedin, Otago, New Zealand, aged only 47. Robert had died in December 1889. They had no children. With the exception of legacies of £500 each to 2 of the executors of Robert's estate, his estate was entirely left to his wife Emma. His death and her death was only 4 months apart, so his executors sold land on Aroa Downs by auction for £52,000. In respect of his wife after her April 1890 death, up until the 31st of December 1891, there were £87,000 more in land sales. There was also probate of her will in England, with the value of her personalty assets there £14,000 that was most likely her share in the Hawdon Trust. She was the sister of Alice, the wife of Edward Wingfield Humphreys, the member of Christchurch North in the New Zealand Parliament, who after provision for legacies was left half of the residue of the estate, with the other half to be invested and income paid for life to her brother, Cyril Goodrich Hawdon. Another brother, Arthur Joseph Hawdon, was left £500 a year life annuity. There were several other bequests to Hawdon relatives, and a charitable bequest of £5,000 to the Otago Hospital and Charitable Aid Board for the relief of patients in the Dunedin Hospital, and £6,000 to the Dunedin Diocesan Trust Board to be used solely to build a church near Duntroon for the members of the Church of England. Their next child was Arthur Joseph Hawdon, who was born on the 5th of January 1844 in Heidelberg. In 1870 he purchased land at Heathcote, New Zealand, he called Grasmere. On the 10th of October 1872, Arthur married Sarah Elizabeth Barker. In 1891 they were living at Rangitata, Timaru, Canterbury, New Zealand. They had a daughter Emma in 1873 and a son Kinyard in 1877, who died in India in 1910, aged only 33. And Arthur died on the 29th of March 1920 at Rangitata, Timaru, Canterbury, New Zealand. The third child was Cyril Goodrich Hawdon. He was born on the 9th of September 1846 in Heidelberg. He lived at Rakaya, Canterbury, New Zealand, and married Mary Charlotte Georgina Strachey on the 27th of September 1881 at Shepton Mallet, Oak Hill, Somerset, England. Cyril was 12 years older than Mary. They had 3 children, the first born in England, and he died on the 2nd of July 1917 in Sussex, England. The fourth born was Alice in 1848 in Heidelberg, who married Edward Wingfield Humphreys on the 22nd of April 1869 at the St John the Baptist Church in Christchurch. Edward was 7 years older than Alice, and he died in April 1892 in England. Alice then married Colonel Henry Courtley on the 14th of April 1896 in London, when she was 48 and Henry 57. Alice died on the 1st of June 1934 at Hurst Green, London, England. The next child was Rupert Wycliffe Hawdon. He was stillborn at Heidelberg in 1852. And the sixth child from his second marriage, Rose, was born on the 20th of April 1870 in Panama. She lived in England with Hawdon relatives when she was 21, and she married Philip Harding Papillon on the 18th of September 1895 at the Holy Trinity Church in Chelsea, England, when she was 25 and Philip 22. They had 2 children, and she died on the 27th of April 1916 in Battle, Sussex, England, aged only 46. In part 2, I'll be covering Charles Bonney's story, including 2 of his nephews that came to Australia that had quite an interesting story of their own.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.